Thank you, Hoseas. I love a good comeback story, don't you? We love to hear stories about comebacks, and we're going to start a new series today. It's a series of lessons. We're going to look at some comeback stories in the Bible. These are going to be primarily, I'm going to talk to you in the weeks to come. I'm sure I'm going to share some examples of comebacks that we're familiar with, and we'll talk about some more of those as we go along. But we love a good comeback story. We love to celebrate the comeback story. If I asked you who in Scripture, who do you think of when you think of a comeback story? A lot of you are going to think about Paul, you're going to think about, we're going to talk about today the character of Joseph. And we're going to be doing some of these character studies. And so this is not something typical format, not something I do. I don't love character studies all the time. For a couple of reasons, and I just want to kind of put some caveats out there before we get started with these to understand that the primary reason to read Scripture and what we sometimes miss when we teach all these little stories to kids as they're growing up, we want to sometimes look at as characters, as like try to find moral lessons from these characters. And that's not we can sometimes do that. It's just not what I would call the primary reason for this, okay? The primary reason we study characters is to see God working in the lives of these characters and situations. And so as we think through some characters, don't want us to lose sight of the fact that everything in Scripture points to Jesus. And therefore, when we see God at work, we want to see primarily not to pat Joseph on the back or pat Paul on the back or pat Peter on the back. We want to instead see how God has worked in these lives to bring them back. And that's what we're going to do. And you're going to learn, as we're going to learn today, we're going to kind of focus on some of Joseph's character traits. And you can learn some good character traits from a story. And there's nothing wrong with that. But really, ultimately, what should we leave Joseph's story, as we're going to talk about briefly this morning, what should we leave Joseph's story doing? Not praising Joseph, even though Joseph had much to praise, but instead praising God for how God works together a beautiful story. God is the master storyteller. The Bible is a story about comebacks. As a matter of fact, because man falls so much and because we mess up so much, we better hope it's a story about comebacks because we've all been down before. And the Israelite people were absolutely just this constant, I use this phrase all the time, you've heard me say it, they were just roller coasters. They were up and then they were down. And God, they would go through periods where they were typically very short periods of faithfulness, and then they would find themselves right back down. They were just, and many times we see that and we say, well, why couldn't they stay faithful to God until we turn mirror on ourselves and ask the question, why too are we the same exact way? Why do we have these moments we're on fire and we're passionate, life's good, we're spiritual, and then the next minute we feel like we're in a valley? And why are we in this valley? Sometimes we don't even know. We just are. And so we're going to study stories of comebacks. So hopefully you, if you're in a valley, you'll be motivated to say, I'm not going to stay in the valley, but rather I'm going to passionately pursue God again. So very briefly this morning, we're going to be quick with this. We just want to study the story of Joseph very briefly. On the screen up here, I don't know if you'll be able to read it, but it's a timeline of Joseph's life. And very briefly, just want to kind of connect you into the Joseph story. If you're not familiar with the Joseph story, many of you will be, but some of you may not be, and that's fine too. But Joseph was born as the 11th of 12 sons to Jacob. At 6 years old, they moved to Canaan with the family. Joseph was the favorite child. You all, if you don't know anything about Jesus, and you don't know anything about the Bible very much at all, there's a good chance, because of popular culture even, I could ask you what color was Joseph's coat, and you could tell me, right? You'd probably say it was amazing, and it was technicolor, and it was multicolor, right? Joseph, you know that Joseph had this coat that had many colors. It was a gift from him to his dad, and it caused a lot of friction in his family, a lot of big friction between him and his other brothers. So at 17 years old, as an act of jealousy, his brothers sell him into slavery as a slave. But just look at the trajectory of what happens over the coming years. At 17 years old, he becomes a slave, and he goes into a house. He goes into Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's a man of wealth, and there he becomes, as we're going to see, a master of the house, so to speak, and was basically second in the command of this man's wealth and everything that went with it. But then Potiphar's wife accuses Joseph of molesting her sexually. And he finds himself at the age of about 20, in his 20s, he finds himself in jail. At 28 years old, he has the opportunity to do what Joseph does many instances if you read through Joseph. And by the way, the book of Genesis really zooms in on Joseph. It spends a lot of time talking about Joseph. And so therefore we can understand the story may have some significance to us to understand the trajectory of the Jewish culture. So at 28, he interprets dreams. He's in prison. He interprets dreams for Pharaoh's butler and baker. And in those dreams, he literally spares the life of one of them. And it just so happens that this guy who he saved his life forgets about it for 2 years. I don't know how we do that, but something incredible happens because during that time, Pharaoh starts having these dreams, and it was one of those situations where it was like an aha moment. Oh yeah, I once had my dreams interpreted. It saved my life, and I would be dead without it. And now suddenly I remember. I don't know that he necessarily forgot up here, but you can forget something without forgetting up here. When the Bible talks about forgetting something, it doesn't necessarily mean they didn't have brain knowledge, but he just put it in the back. And so Joseph, who finds himself in prison for doing this situation, he finds himself in a pit up here, and he finds himself in prison down here, and then all of a sudden he comes to become second in command, rises to become second in command to Pharaoh. But there's famine coming. There's time where God's people, and not only God's people, but the whole Eastern culture are about to go through a severe famine. And because of that, there's going to be this situation at 37, there's going to be this end of the years of plenty. But because of Joseph interpreting these dreams, the people are well prepared for it. Pharaoh and the officers were well prepared for it, but not everybody was. His brothers are going to come back to him, and they're going to be begging for food, thinking Joseph's dead. And if you know the story, you know Joseph eventually reveals himself to his brothers that he is indeed it. And he gets to reunite with this father who loved him so dearly. And at 56 years old, about 17 years after this happened, so Joseph does get some time back with his father at the end. Jacob go on to die. And that is just a very, very quick explanation of Joseph's life. But I want to encourage you to recognize a couple things through Joseph's story. If you're familiar with Joseph's story, this will make more sense to you. If you're not, I encourage you to go to the book of Genesis this week and read through his story. I want you to note that Joseph took his character with him into every circumstance. You cannot control your circumstances. We are masters of wanting control, and we try to control everything. But at the end of the day, we only have a small glimpse of control over our circumstances. You are here today, probably in many cases, because you were born in this part of the country. If you were born in, let's throw out a country, if you were born in China, it's unlikely that you would be here today. Now, I'm not saying we may have some people of Chinese descent here, so it's maybe possible, but it's unlikely. There's a good chance. How many of you, just by a show of hands, were born? I was born at St. Vincent's Hospital right over here, 3 or 4 miles. How many of you were born within 100 miles of where you are right now? Just a show of hands. You may not see it, but a lot of hands just went up in the audience. So, would you say that you had control over where you were born? No, but it definitely has impacted you. You can't control your circumstances, only very little. What you're born into, the things that surround you. But here's what you can do if you're a Christian. You can take your character and you can take your God into every circumstance with you. And that's the most important thing you can do. We're not defined by our circumstances. We're defined by how we go into our circumstances and how we come out of our circumstances. Notice just real quickly with me, look at what happens with Joseph. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. This is not a situation you want to be in. He's sold into slavery. Slavery is not fun. And we can debate all day about what slavery looked like there as opposed to our images of slavery and that sort of thing. But Joseph does not have control over his circumstances. That's one thing all slaves, no matter the forms of slavery may be, it's an equality of all slaves, is that slaves don't have control anymore of their circumstances. But Joseph found favor in his eyes, in Potiphar's eyes, and he became his attendant. And Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. It would have been easy for Joseph to have gone to Potiphar's house with a very sour attitude and not done anything to magnify God. But instead, Joseph goes into Potiphar's house, and not only does he live and exist, but he thrives in the environment because he turns out to be somebody who is trustworthy. And because of that, he shows it. But he doesn't stay there. Joseph eventually does get put into jail, but so the warden put Joseph. Joseph goes to jail, which is even worse than being a slave, most likely. Maybe not in every instance in this part of the world, but most likely worse. The warden finds Joseph and puts him in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. This doesn't happen in our world, right? How many times have you seen on the news about the fact that there's a prison, and the prison is now being run by one of the prisoners? Every now and then I will see a situation where they allow somebody who has some kind of record to come in and work in a prison. But it takes decades upon decades, and it's sure enough not the person who's incarcerated in the prison at the time. You see, he gained the trust. He was so trustworthy that even though he went into prison, he was still trustworthy in his circumstances. But it doesn't end there. Eventually, Joseph becomes second in all of the land of Egypt. He's second in charge. And Pharaoh says this, "You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." He literally gives Joseph ultimate power over everything that happens in the kingdom. Why? This was a guy that was locked up in the jail. He suddenly let's just go back. He's enslaved. He becomes head of the master's house. You see a pattern here happening? He goes into jail, and all of a sudden he's in charge of the jail. He eventually interprets a dream for Pharaoh, and all of a sudden he's in charge of everything. He's always, by the way, always second in command. There's always somebody just over him. That's why he keeps falling back down, it seems. But needless to say, you see this pattern where Joseph enters into dire circumstances, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And on every occasion, Joseph's character, who he was, but more important than who he was, it was who he belonged to, kept rising to the top. And because of that, he was able to glorify God in these circumstances. Joseph recognized that there were bigger things going on than what he could see. I want to encourage you, if you're going through a valley in your life right now, and if there's 10 people in a room, somebody's in a valley. I don't know what the statistics are. I'm just telling you, if they're in a room like this, there's somebody here in a valley. You're in a situation in life where you're struggling to see God's purpose and God's plan. And I believe God has a plan for you. I believe God does not give up on that plan for you. I believe sometimes as people, it's sometimes tough for us to see that plan, though. The plan doesn't change. It's just our vision of the plan changes. And Joseph recognized that there were bigger things on the horizon. He was able to, even in the pits of despair, literally the pit and in the prison, he's able to see that there were bigger things going on than what he could even see. And because of that, Joseph goes on to do great things. Notice this text. "And now do not be distressed, do not be angry with yourselves." This is Joseph's brothers come back to him. They've thrown him in a pit of slavery. They figured he probably has passed away by now. At least he's out of their hair. And he reveals himself to them. And notice what he says. "Don't be distressed, don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here. because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. I was not aware, and you were not aware, but God intended to work that thing that you did to me in order to save people's lives. I can't help but think that when Joseph was first thrown in that pit as a 17-year-old, this was not even on his mind. He couldn't see it. But for some reason, he remained faithful. When he rose to power in Potiphar's house and had a pretty good life going on, and then he suddenly gets accused of sexually molesting Potiphar's wife, I venture to say that when he gets thrown into the pits of the jail, and then he interprets a dream that saves the life of an official in Pharaoh's court, thinking, surely this is mountain. That's what he asks him. He says, just remember me when you go. And he's forgotten for 2 years, just hanging out in the prison. You have to think in all those situations that it would have been really tough to see that God was going to save a bunch of people's lives through Joseph. But Joseph recognized, on the back end at least, he recognized that God had been doing something bigger in his life all along. For 2 years now, there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years, there's going to be no plowing and no reaping. Their famine is going to continue, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. I cannot stress enough the power and significance of that passage. Because Joseph did not say, at first up here he does, he says, hey, God sent me ahead so that lives could be saved. But Joseph turns around and says, no, it wasn't just lives that could be saved. He let you enslave me and sell me and convince my father that I was dead so that I could save your life. Man, what character Joseph had to recognize the plan of how God was going to preserve in its very infant days the people of Israel, the people of Abraham, this family that would be so special to him. And if not for Joseph's perseverance, most of these brothers would have likely died. They wouldn't have been able to live out this life, and who knows where we are today. But Joseph represents a key cog in the wheel of how God continues to preserve His people and keep His people safe even in very dire, dark circumstances. He's putting together not only a plan in Joseph's life, but He's putting together a grand plan that goes through and feeds through Joseph. He says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. God, what you did, you had all the worst motives, all the worst. You put me in a cave, in a pit. This was not you being healthy or thinking right. Don't mistake it. You intended to harm me. Joseph is not naive to the fact that the brothers had every intention, and many of them wanted to kill him in that moment. But God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph comes out on the other side of all of these valleys. And on this other side of the mountaintop, he looks back. And you know what he sees in the pit? You know what he sees in the jail? Do you know what he sees in slavery? He sees God working. Those are not places where it's easy to see God working, but He does. And He took His character into all those places, but more importantly, He took His God into all those places. And because of that, he was able to look back into all those situations and see God's hand at work. Sometimes the radical comeback is going to require radical trust. Sometimes in life, when you can't see tomorrow, much less a year from now, when you can't see 5 years from now, much less 1 year from now, when you can't see as God's children, sometimes you've just got to trust in God that you may be in the pit, and you may be enslaved to something, and you may be in life's valley, but if you're there with God, there's a plan, and God's going to bring you up out of that pit, and God's going to bring you up out of that slavery, and God's going to bring you up out of that jail, because you're trusting in His promises, and you're trusting that there's a plan bigger than what you could see. So I want to be a comeback kid. I want to be a comeback kid in my life so that while I'm in the valleys, and while I may not be able to see, I'm instead of trusting on my ability to figure it out, because that's what we tend to do as humans. We'll figure it out. I'll figure it out. Instead, I want us to be totally reliant on the promises of God. See, the thing about comeback kids is that for Christians, we're all comeback kids. If you're a Christ follower, if you've put off the old self, you're a comeback kid because sin had defeated you. And when sin defeats you, when you put on Jesus, when you make that decision to follow Him, when you make that decision to become a Christian, you become a comeback kid. You're not a comeback kid because of what you did, though. You're a comeback kid because who you put radical trust in to bring you out of the valley. You don't save yourself. You are saved by Jesus Christ. If you've never been a comeback kid, here's the thing we teach in our society. You go broke, you start earning your way back. You start working harder and working harder. And in many ways, by worldly perspectives, that's right. That's sometimes what you have to do. But as a Christian, when you realize you're broken, when you realize sin is in your life and you need it, you can't work your way out of that. You've got to trust in somebody who's sitting above, looking at a bigger plan, and can bring you the comeback that you so desperately need in your life. Jesus is the answer for your life. Jesus was the answer. God was the answer for Joseph's life. He's who brought him up out of these valleys, and He can be the answer for your life too. If you've never chosen to follow Jesus, I encourage you to put your trust in Him. Let Him wash away your sins in baptism. When you rise up and you walk differently, you're different. You go as a different character into life circumstances. And it wasn't because Joseph could always see, but he always kept, seemingly, everything we see about Joseph, he's just trusting in the promises of God. He's doing what he can on his end, but at the end of the day, it's God who brings him through the other side. And the same can be true for you if you've never been a Christian. Or maybe you're in a valley and you're struggling and you want to see God's promises and you want to see, and we all want to see. None of us like not having control. But we all go through periods where we can't see. And maybe you're in that valley and you're struggling, you need some kind of spiritual help. We, as your spiritual family, want to encourage you and be with you. If you've got any spiritual needs, you can let me know while we'll stand and sing a song together.